A wife looked for proof of cheating and discovered her husband's dark secret synopsis. At first, it was just a feeling. Late nights, unexplained absences, a phone always face down. Convinced her husband was cheating, she began quietly searching for proof. What she uncovered, however, had nothing to do with another woman. Hidden behind routine and silence was a dark secret that redefined everything she thought she knew about the man she married. As the truth emerged, betrayal took on a new meaning, one far deeper and more unsettling than infidelity. Some discoveries don't end marriages, they change how you see reality forever. If this story helps you recognize that sometimes the truth is more complicated than you imagined, please leave a like and subscribe. There's a particular kind of dread that comes from suspecting betrayal, but not having proof, from watching someone you love become a stranger through accumulated small changes that individually seem explainable, but collectively create pattern of deception you can't quite name or confront. For 8 months, I watched my husband Daniel transform from the man I'd known for 12 years into someone distant and secretive, someone whose explanations for late nights and locked phones and unexplained absences were technically plausible, but felt increasingly hollow. I was certain he was having an affair. What else could explain the sudden need for privacy, the defensive reactions when questioned, the emotional distance that had grown between us like a chasm neither of us acknowledged directly? So I did what many spouses in my position do. I started investigating quietly, searching for evidence that would confirm what I already believed I knew. What I discovered instead was so far beyond infidelity, so fundamentally different from the betrayal I'd been expecting, that it didn't just end my marriage, it changed how I understood reality itself, forced me to reconsider everything I thought I knew about the man I'd built a life with and about my own capacity to recognize danger living beside me. My name is Jennifer Walsh, and I'm 36 years old. I'd been married to Daniel for 12 years when the changes in his behavior became impossible to ignore or rationalize away. 12 years during which I'd believed we had a solid, if not passionate marriage, a comfortable partnership built on shared values and compatible life goals. Daniel worked as an accountant for a mid-sized firm, steady career that provided reliable income without being particularly exciting or demanding. I worked as an elementary school teacher, a job I loved for its meaningful engagement with children, even though the salary was modest. We lived in a comfortable house in a quiet suburban neighborhood, had an active social life with couple friends and separate friend groups, presented as successful, stable couple to everyone around us. The changes in Daniel's behavior began gradually about 8 months before my discovery. Subtle at first, but progressively more obvious and harder to explain away. He started working late more frequently, claiming that his firm had taken on several new clients who required extra hours and attention. He became more protective of his phone, keeping it password protected and face down, taking it with him even when just going to another room. He seemed distracted and distant even when physically present, as if his mind was somewhere else, engaged with concerns or thoughts he couldn't or wouldn't share with me. Our physical intimacy declined during this period as well. Sex that had been regular, if not particularly passionate, became infrequent, then rare, then essentially non-existent. When I tried to initiate, Daniel would claim exhaustion from his increased work hours or stress from the demanding clients he was managing. The rejections accumulated, creating distance that made the emotional disconnection even more pronounced. We were living together but barely connecting, going through domestic routines as roommates rather than as intimate partners. I also noticed financial irregularities that troubled me, but that I couldn't quite explain. Our joint checking account would show withdrawals I didn't recognize, modest amounts, $200 or $300 at a time, frequent enough to be noticeable but not so large as to create immediate crisis. When I asked Daniel about these withdrawals, he'd say they were for work expenses he'd be reimbursed for, or for cash he'd needed for various purposes he'd describe vaguely without providing satisfying detail. The explanations were plausible enough that I didn't push harder, but they accumulated alongside all the other changes into pattern that felt increasingly suspicious. The conclusion I reached, the explanation that seemed to fit all these observations, was that Daniel was having an affair. The late nights were time with another woman. The phone secrecy was hiding communications with her. The emotional distance was guilt and divided attention. The declined intimacy was because he was getting physical needs met elsewhere. The unexplained cash withdrawals were for hotel rooms or gifts for his mistress. It all fit together into narrative that was painful, but understandable. A betrayal I could name and respond to, even if I didn't know yet what that response would be. I started investigating carefully, looking for evidence that would confirm what I believed was happening. I checked Daniel's pockets and wallet when he was sleeping or showering, looking for receipts or phone numbers or any physical evidence of another woman. I tried to access his phone when he left it unattended, though he'd changed the password to something I didn't know and kept the device too secure for me to access it easily. I drove by his office on evenings when he said he was working late, looking to see if his car was actually there or if he was somewhere else. I monitored his behavior for signs I'd read about in articles about infidelity, changes in grooming habits, new cologne, defensive reactions when questioned, classic indicators that someone was involved with another person. The investigation consumed me for weeks, became obsessive focus that occupied my thoughts constantly. I felt like detective in my own life, searching for evidence of betrayal that would explain why my marriage had become so hollow and distant. But despite extensive searching, I found nothing definitively proving an affair. No receipts from hotels or restaurants, no evidence of another woman, no texts or emails that indicated romantic involvement with someone else. The absence of evidence was frustrating, made me doubt my own instincts, even as I remained convinced that something significant was being hidden from me. The breakthrough came not from my deliberate investigation, but from accident. I was cleaning our home office one Saturday when Daniel was out running errands, vacuuming and straightening the desk area where he handled our personal finances and occasionally worked from home. As I moved papers to clean under them, I knocked over a stack of folders that fell behind the desk, sliding into the narrow space between the desk and the wall. When I pulled the desk away from the wall to retrieve the fallen folders, I found something else that had apparently been deliberately hidden in that space. A small lockbox, the kind people use to secure important documents or modest amounts of cash, pushed far enough behind the desk that it wouldn't be visible or accessible without moving the furniture. The lockbox was locked, but the key was on Daniel's key ring, which he'd left at home when going out for errands. I knew I was crossing a line by opening something Daniel had deliberately hidden and secured, knew that I was violating his privacy in ways that couldn't be undone. But I was desperate for answers to explain his changed behavior, convinced that whatever was in this hidden lockbox would provide the evidence of infidelity I'd been seeking. I took Daniel's keys, found the small key that fit the lockbox, and opened it with hands that shook from combination of fear and anticipation. What I found inside wasn't evidence of an affair. There were no love letters or hotel receipts or photos of Daniel with another woman. Instead, the lockbox contained financial documents, bank statements for accounts I didn't know existed, credit card statements for cards in only Daniel's name that I'd never seen or known about, loan documents for money borrowed from institutions I didn't recognize. And as I looked through these documents, trying to understand what they represented and why Daniel had hidden them, the pattern became devastatingly clear. Daniel had been systematically embezzling money from his employer for at least 3 years, had accumulated gambling debts of over $180,000, and had been using borrowed money and stolen funds to cover both the gambling losses and the ongoing concealment of his activities. The bank statements showed accounts containing significant amounts: $127,000 in one account, $43,000 in another, money that Daniel had apparently taken from his employer and was holding in private accounts I'd known nothing about. The credit card statements showed charges at casinos and to online gambling sites, tens of thousands of dollars spent over years on betting that had apparently been consistently losing rather than winning. The loan documents showed personal loans totaling $180,000 from predatory lenders with interest rates that would be impossible to manage on Daniel's legitimate salary, loans he'd apparently taken to cover previous gambling losses, and to repay money he'd temporarily borrowed from his employer, before subsequent embezzlement had allowed him to maintain the whole desperate cycle. I sat on the floor of our home office surrounded by these documents, feeling reality shift in ways that were disorienting and nauseating. Daniel wasn't having an affair. He was a criminal engaged in systematic theft from his employer, was a gambling addict who'd accumulated debts so massive he'd resorted to embezzlement to try to manage them, was living a double life that involved illegal activity and financial deception, far more serious than romantic betrayal. The late nights weren't with another woman. They were at casinos or online gambling sites, feeding addiction that had consumed increasingly large portions of his time and attention. The phone secrecy wasn't hiding communications with a mistress. It was hiding gambling activity and communications with lenders he'd borrowed from, and possibly with accomplices or others involved in his criminal activities. The cash withdrawals I'd noticed weren't for hotels or gifts for another woman. They were small amounts Daniel was taking to gamble with or to make minimum payments on his crushing debt. The emotional distance wasn't guilt about romantic betrayal. It was the psychological toll of maintaining massive deception, of living with fear of being caught, of trying to manage the impossible spiral of gambling addiction and criminal activity that had taken over his life. Everything I'd interpreted as signs of infidelity were actually signs of something much darker and more destructive: criminal behavior, severe addiction, and a web of lies so extensive that I'd been living with a stranger for years without recognizing who he actually was. I took photos of all the documents with my phone, documenting the evidence of embezzlement and debt, creating record of what I'd discovered before Daniel returned home and potentially moved or destroyed the evidence. Then I carefully returned everything to the lockbox, locked it, returned it to its hiding place behind the desk, and tried to compose myself to appear normal when Daniel came home. I needed time to think, to decide what to do with this information, to understand the full implications of what I'd discovered before confronting Daniel or taking any action. When Daniel returned home an hour later, I acted completely normal, asked about his errands, discussed plans for dinner, maintained our usual surface routines. But inside I was in turmoil, looking at my husband and seeing a stranger, someone who'd been stealing significant money from his employer, who'd accumulated debt so massive it would take years to repay, who'd been lying to me daily about fundamentally important aspects of his life and his activities. Every interaction felt surreal. Watching him perform normalcy while knowing that the comfortable life we seemed to be living was built on crime and deception, an addiction I'd been completely unaware of. Over the weekend, I researched compulsive gambling and embezzlement, trying to understand what Daniel had gotten himself into and what the likely consequences would be when his activities were discovered, as they inevitably would be, since embezzlement schemes eventually fail when the missing money becomes too large to hide, or when audits reveal discrepancies that can't be explained away. I learned that embezzlement prosecutions typically resulted in prison sentences, that the amounts Daniel had taken were serious felonies, that his professional accounting license would certainly be revoked, that our family finances would be devastated by restitution requirements and legal costs. I learned that gambling addiction was a recognized psychological disorder, but that it didn't excuse criminal behavior undertaken to fund the addiction, that treatment was possible, but recovery rates were modest and relapse was common. I also had to confront what Daniel's activities meant for me and my own legal exposure. Had I benefited from stolen money in ways that would make me legally liable? Our joint accounts showed no large unexplained deposits, and our lifestyle hadn't changed significantly over the period Daniel had apparently been embezzling, suggesting he'd been using the stolen money to cover gambling losses and debts rather than to enhance our family finances. But I knew I needed legal advice about my own position, needed to understand whether my ignorance of Daniel's criminal activity would protect me from legal consequences, or whether I could be held responsible for not knowing what my husband was doing. On Monday morning after Daniel left for work, I called a criminal defense attorney whose name I'd found through online research. I explained my situation carefully. I'd discovered evidence that my husband had been embezzling from his employer and had accumulated massive gambling debts. I'd had no prior knowledge of these activities, and I needed to understand my legal obligations and exposures. The attorney, a woman named Patricia Morrison, scheduled an immediate consultation, told me that the situation was serious and time-sensitive given the criminal activities involved. Patricia reviewed the photos I'd taken of Daniel's hidden documents, confirmed that they appeared to show systematic embezzlement and significant financial crimes. She explained that while I personally was likely not legally liable for Daniel's criminal activities given that I'd had no knowledge or involvement, I had legal obligation to report the crimes once I'd discovered them, that concealing knowledge of felonies could potentially make me an accessory after the fact. She recommended I report Daniel's embezzlement to his employer and to law enforcement immediately, both to fulfill my legal obligations and to protect myself from any claim that I'd knowingly benefited from criminal proceeds. "I know he's your husband," Patricia said gently, "and I know reporting him will have devastating consequences for him and for your family. But he's committed serious crimes. He's stolen significant money from his employer, and this is going to come out eventually whether you report it or not. The question is whether you're going to be proactive in reporting it and protecting yourself, or whether you're going to wait until he's caught and potentially face legal consequences yourself for having known and not reported. You also need to think about whether you can live with yourself if his employer suffers additional losses because you stayed silent when you could have stopped it." The decision was agonizing, but ultimately clear. I couldn't continue living in marriage built on crime and deception, couldn't knowingly allow Daniel's employer to continue suffering losses when I had information that could stop it, couldn't risk my own legal liability by concealing knowledge of serious felonies. I told Patricia to proceed with reporting Daniel's embezzlement to appropriate authorities, to help me navigate the legal and financial consequences that would follow, and to represent my interests in the separation and divorce that would necessarily follow this revelation. That evening, when Daniel came home from work, I confronted him with what I'd discovered. I told him I'd found the hidden lockbox, had seen the bank statements and loan documents, had documented all the evidence of embezzlement and gambling debt. I told him I'd consulted with an attorney, and that his crimes were being reported to his employer and to law enforcement. I told him our marriage was over, that I couldn't continue being married to someone who'd been engaged in systematic criminal activity and had lied to me about fundamental aspects of his life for years. Daniel's reaction moved through several stages: initial shock and denial, then desperate pleading as he realized I had comprehensive evidence and had already taken steps to report him, then anger and accusation that I was betraying him by reporting his activities rather than helping him cover them up or work through his problems privately. He tried to frame his embezzlement as borrowing that he'd intended to pay back, tried to minimize the gambling as a problem he was handling, tried to blame me for not being supportive enough when he was struggling with addiction. But none of his justifications or deflections could change the fundamental reality. He'd stolen significant money from his employer, had accumulated massive debt through gambling addiction, had lied to me systematically for years about where he was and what he was doing. Daniel was arrested at his workplace the next day, charged with embezzlement and wire fraud and other financial crimes related to his theft from his employer. The amounts he'd taken were significant enough that he was facing substantial prison time. Eventually, he was sentenced to 6 years in federal prison after pleading guilty to reduced charges. His accounting license was revoked, his professional career was destroyed, his reputation was ruined. The house we'd lived in together had to be sold to pay partial restitution to his employer, though the amount Daniel had stolen was far larger than our home equity could cover. The comfortable middle-class life we'd built together disintegrated within weeks of my discovery, replaced by criminal prosecution and financial devastation, and the complete destruction of everything I'd believed about my marriage and my husband. The divorce proceeded parallel to Daniel's criminal case. I filed immediately after his arrest, sought to protect whatever assets I could claim as separate property from the restitution requirements that would consume most of our marital assets. Daniel tried to contest the divorce initially, seemed to believe I should stand by him through his legal troubles, but eventually accepted that our marriage was irretrievably broken. The final divorce decree gave me the modest assets I'd brought into the marriage and my own retirement accounts, left Daniel responsible for all the debt and restitution requirements his criminal activities had created. The months following my discovery and Daniel's arrest were surreal and devastating in ways different from what I'd anticipated when I'd first suspected he was cheating. Learning that your husband is having an affair is painful, but understandable. Infidelity is common. The dynamics are familiar. There are established social scripts for how to process and respond to romantic betrayal. Learning that your husband is a criminal, that he's been systematically stealing from his employer for years, that he has gambling addiction severe enough to drive him to felony embezzlement, that's a different kind of betrayal that doesn't come with established scripts or familiar patterns for processing. I had to confront that I'd been living with someone engaged in serious criminal activity without having any awareness of it, that my instincts and attention had been so focused on the wrong explanation, affair, that I'd completely missed the actual truth, crime and addiction. I had to process that the comfortable life I'd been living was built on money Daniel had stolen, even if that money hadn't directly enhanced our lifestyle, even if I'd had no knowledge of where it came from. I had to reconsider everything I'd believed about Daniel, his character, his values, his capacity for deception, and recognize that the person I'd married and lived with for 12 years had dimensions I'd never seen or understood. Friends and family struggled to understand what had happened and how I'd handled it. Some thought I'd been too harsh in reporting Daniel's crimes, rather than trying to help him get treatment and pay back what he'd stolen privately. Others thought I should have known something was wrong earlier, should have caught the signs of gambling addiction and financial crimes before they'd progressed so far. A few, usually people who'd experienced similar revelations in their own relationships, understood that discovering your spouse is engaged in serious criminal activity creates impossible situation where there are no good options, only choices between different kinds of devastation. My work as an elementary school teacher, which I'd always found fulfilling and meaningful, became complicated by my association with Daniel's crimes. Parents in the community knew that I'd been married to the accountant who'd been arrested for embezzlement, speculated about what I'd known and when I'd known it, wondered whether I was trustworthy to teach their children given my apparent failure to recognize criminal behavior in my own husband. I had to endure awkward conversations and subtle social consequences, despite having done nothing wrong beyond failing to notice that the person closest to me was living a double life. 3 years after discovering Daniel's crimes and divorcing him, I'm 39 and rebuilt into a life that's simpler but more honest than what I had during my marriage. I live in a modest apartment, have learned to manage finances carefully on my teacher's salary alone without the buffer of Daniel's former income, have rebuilt social connections with people who understand what I went through and don't judge me for it. I still teach, still find meaning in working with children, still believe that building authentic life is possible even after discovering that the previous life was built on deception and crime I'd been completely unaware of. Daniel will be released from prison in a few years, will re-enter the world with criminal record and destroyed professional reputation, will have to rebuild life from devastation his own choices created. I have no contact with him, and don't plan to establish any. Our marriage and the life we built together died completely when I discovered who he actually was beneath the performance of normalcy he'd maintained for years. Sometimes I think about the life I thought I was living, the husband I thought I knew, and recognize how little relationship my beliefs bore to actual reality I was living in. What I learned from investigating what I thought was infidelity and discovering instead a dark secret involving crime and addiction is that sometimes betrayal is more complicated than romantic disloyalty, that the lies people tell can go far deeper than covering up affairs, that you can live beside someone for years and be completely wrong about who they fundamentally are. I'd been searching for evidence of cheating, preparing myself emotionally for the particular pain of romantic betrayal. What I found instead shattered not just my marriage, but my understanding of reality itself, forced me to reconsider my capacity to recognize danger and deception, taught me that the most serious betrayals sometimes have nothing to do with other women and everything to do with who someone chooses to be when they think no one is watching. My name is Jennifer Walsh. I suspected my husband was cheating, spent months investigating quietly, searching for proof that would confirm the betrayal I was certain was happening. What I discovered instead was that Daniel had been systematically embezzling from his employer for 3 years, had accumulated $180,000 in gambling debts, was living a double life built on crime and addiction I'd never suspected. The revelation didn't end with confrontation and divorce. It required reporting him to authorities, watching him be arrested and prosecuted and sent to prison, seeing our comfortable life completely disintegrate as consequences of his criminal activities became undeniable. Some discoveries don't just end marriages. They change how you see reality forever, force you to recognize that the person you thought you knew was a carefully maintained performance concealing someone you never understood at all. Thank you for reading. If this story helped you recognize that sometimes the truth is more complicated than you imagined, please like and subscribe.